Good evening, everyone. My name is G. Davis, and I am the University Librarian at American University. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this event featuring Bill Gentile, one of our renowned faculty members and special collections donor, and distinguished guest, Ambassador William Taylor. Using excerpts from Bill's recently published memoir, Wait for Me, True Stories of War, Love, and Rock and Roll as conversational constructs, Ambassador Taylor and Bill will delve into their backgrounds and expertise to discuss the human cost of war and to answer questions such as what makes a conflict a just war and what role should journalism play in times of war. Several years ago, Bill Gentile selected the American University Library as the archive for his life's work, mainly documenting conflict in Latin America, the Caribbean, the Middle East, and Africa. His archive contains over 30,000 images and reporters' notebooks which span over 16 countries from the 1970s through 1990s. Bill's archive represents truth-telling, knowledge creation, and documentary evidence. He has been a generous partner and advocate of the University Library since then. American University Library is the perfect venue to facilitate active conversations on critical topics among scholars, professionals, and the public, like this event. Libraries represent civilization. Libraries increase equity. Libraries expand knowledge, and libraries create opportunities for change and dialogue. Sharing information as widely and equitably as possible is at the heart of what we do here at the American University Library. And it's central to American University's culture of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We are honored to have both Bill Gentile and Ambassador Taylor sharing with us today. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you enjoyed this evening's conversation.
All right, good evening, and thank you all again for joining us. I'm Leslie Nellis, Head Archivist for Special Collections and Digital Initiatives at American University Library. I've worked closely with Bill for several years now after he's donated his photojournalism archive to Special Collections, and I've known Bill as a dedicated professor and passionate journalist. I was so pleased that Bill approached the library to hold this conversation. Before I introduce our esteemed speakers tonight, I want to thank my colleagues Michaela Bowen and Claire Young for their hard work on tonight's event. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our two distinguished guests this evening. Bill Gentile is an independent National Emmy Award-winning journalist and documentary filmmaker teaching at American University. His career spans 4 decades, 5 continents, and nearly every facet of journalism and mass communication. Bill began in 1977 as a reporter for the Mexico City News and correspondent for United Press International. He covered the 1979 Sandinista Revolution, after which he spent 2 years as editor on UPI's foreign desk in New York, then moved to Nicaragua and became Newsweek magazine's contract photographer for Latin America and the Caribbean. He's since covered the US-backed Contra War in Nicaragua, the Salvadoran Civil War, the US invasion of Panama, the 1994 invasion of Haiti, the ongoing conflict with Cuba, the 1990 and 91 Persian Gulf War, and subsequent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. He's also worked across Latin America and the Caribbean, and in Ivory Coast, Guinea, Sierra Leone, Chad, Angola, Rwanda, and Burundi. He's a pioneer of backpack video journalism and an acclaimed author on the topic. He's also been collaborating with the University Center for Latin American and Latino Studies on filmmaking. Bill's the director and executive producer of the documentary series Freelancers with Bill Gentile, and he's engineered the School of Communications partnership with the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. Most recently, Bill is the author of his recently published memoir, Wait for Me, True Stories of War, Love, and Rock and Roll, which he calls a firsthand frontline account of the human cost of war. It's also my great honor to introduce Ambassador William B. Taylor. He's Vice President, Russia and Europe at the U.S. Institute of Peace. In 2019, he served as the Chargé d'Affaires at the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv. During the Arab Spring, he oversaw U.S. assistance and support to Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and Syria. He served as the U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine from 2006 to 2009. Ambassador Taylor also served as the U.S. government's representative to the Mideast Quartet, which facilitated the Israeli disengagement from Gaza and parts of the West Bank. He served in Baghdad as the first director of Iraq Reconstruction Management Office from 2004 to 2005, and in Kabul as coordinator of international and U.S. assistance to Afghanistan from 2002 to 2003. Ambassador Taylor was also coordinator of U.S. assistance to the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. He earlier served on the staff of Senator Bill Bradley. Ambassador Taylor is also a graduate of West Point and Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. He served as infantry platoon leader and combat company commander in the U.S. Army in Vietnam and Germany. This evening, Bill Gentile will lead a conversation with Ambassador Taylor using excerpts from his memoir, Wait for Me, to illuminate their shared experiences in the human cost of war. We'll hear about defining just wars, whether the West is morally obligated to support Ukraine, and what role should journalism play in a time of war. Following the conversation, there will be time for questions. Please use the Q&A function to submit your questions, and I'll be back at the end to moderate. Finally, after the program, we will select 3 attendees to win an autographed copy of Bill's new memoir, Wait for Me. We'll contact you via email if you've won and work out the logistics. Thank you both, Bill and Ambassador Taylor, for leading us through this conversation this evening. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Bill Gentile to get us started. Please enjoy the program.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. This event is a product of the university's quest to play an important role, not just in our own community, but beyond the confines of this institution as well. And despite what some are calling Ukraine fatigue, part of our role means maintaining an informed and thoughtful awareness of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I had known Ambassador Taylor only from the November 2019 televised impeachment hearings of Donald Trump, who allegedly tried to muscle Ukraine into finding dirt on Joe Biden and his family. Last month, I watched Ambassador Taylor's discussion of Ukraine with NBC anchor Chuck Todd at the United States Institute of Peace here in Washington, D.C., where he currently works. It was then that I learned that Ambassador Taylor had served as a U.S. Army company commander in the war in Vietnam. During that interview, Mr. Ambassador, you said, open quote, "I fought in a morally ambiguous war," close quote, and you meant Vietnam. You went on to say, open quote, "This war that we're talking about here is not morally ambiguous," close quote. And by this war, you meant U.S. assistance to Ukraine to defend itself against the Russian invasion. So, Ambassador Taylor's service fighting in a morally ambiguous war in Vietnam, and my work as correspondent and photojournalist covering the also mostly ambiguous US-backed Contra War in Nicaragua and the Civil War in El Salvador formed the genesis of this event. To be clear, I've never been to Vietnam. I've never served in any military, but I grew up viewing images of Vietnam in Life magazine. As a journalist, I lived in Nicaragua from 1983 until 1990 and spent most of my time covering those two conflicts, which is what my recent memoir is mostly about. I call this book a firsthand frontline account of the human cost of war. Ambassador Taylor and I have much in common. We both are familiar with that human cost of war, about which I believe too many Americans either have never seen or have forgotten. I now see my job as a journalist, as a teacher, and as an American as an opportunity to spread this firsthand frontline account of the human cost of war to as many people as I can. During today's session, I'll read a few paragraphs from my book that illustrate some of the similarities between my and Ambassador Taylor's experiences. As background, you may remember that it was Ronald Reagan who funded and directed the so-called Contra War in a bid to overthrow the Sandinista government that seized power in Nicaragua in 1979. The Contra War was mostly fought in the tropical highlands of northern Nicaragua, a region not unlike some parts of Vietnam. And like the war in Vietnam, the Contra War and the Civil War in El Salvador were guerrilla wars as well. So we've got a lot to talk about. Mr. Ambassador, welcome, and you've got the pulpit.
Pulpit, okay. Bill, thank you very much for having the idea of this conversation. I mean, this is a great topic. I want to thank American University, G, and Leslie for helping to put this on. This is a great opportunity I've been looking forward to this conversation for some time. And as you say, there are a lot of overlaps between what you have been doing, what you've done in your career, what I've done in my career. And we'll be talking tonight, I guess, about kind of three different wars, if you will. We were talking about Vietnam, as you mentioned, where I served. We were talking about Nicaragua and the range of wars that you've covered, but Nicaragua in particular, and then of course Ukraine. And those three, there are some links. Bill, you and I were talking just before we got on here that there are some connections among at least two of these wars. And you with your participation and your observation and reporting from Iraq, and one of those threads is the 101st Airborne, and you served, you were embedded with the 101st during the Iraq War, the first Iraq War, I think. Is that right?
Persian Gulf War.
Persian Gulf War, right? I served in Vietnam in the 101st Airborne. I think there is a participant on this call, Bill, with whom I served in Vietnam. He was another company commander and platoon leader in the 101st, Bobby Seitz. Bobby, if you're on there, greetings. But just to say that that was, the link, by the way, where I was going with that is there's another link that the 101st gives us, which is the 101st is about to deploy to Poland in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the United States strengthening the NATO alliance in response to this new aggression from the Russians. So there's that. 101st in Vietnam, 101st in Persian Gulf War, 101st going to Ukraine, but also about the Vietnam one. I'm reminded that it was 51 years ago when I was there. So it was a long time ago that when Bobby said, Captain Seitz and I, when we were there. And I actually was caught, Bill, I was struck by one of the paragraphs in your book. And I know you're going to read some, but let me read one that I was struck by, which says, this is in your book, again, this is, as you said, this is, wait for me, it looks backwards on this thing, but you can probably read it. There were very few pitched battles between the two armed groups, you said. Instead, the war played out in a series of ambushes or surprise attacks preceded by long stretches of slogging through tropical highlands, through ankle-deep mud, wearing the same wet, filthy, stinking clothes and humping backpacks stuffed with everything I could carry inside plastic bags. That describes what Bobby Seitz and I did in Vietnam very well. And I raised that this kind of the as you say, a long periods of time when we were just humping through the woods. But there were times, and you point this out, where there were explosions and explosive activity and fighting and battles. And it was a long time ago. And I'm reminded of the other book that you probably read, others have probably read, that talks about one of these great big battles. It's called We Were Soldiers Once and Young, by Hal Moore, Colonel Hal Moore. And we'll probably have an opportunity to come back to some of these things, Bill. But just the last thing I'll say in opening goes to your point about Ukraine. And yes, I have made the point a couple of times about how important I think Ukraine is for the United States. It has strategic importance. It's important for reasons that we can talk about later as we go into some detail. But it also brings, and you raised this, moral clarity. I mean, there is a clear aggressor in this war. Unprovoked, unjustified attack by the Russians on a otherwise peaceful neighbor. There's a clear aggressor and there's a clear victor. The moral clarity of this war that the Russians are fighting against Ukraine and the Ukrainians are fighting back, is clear, is clarifying, as you've pointed out. So there's a lot to talk about, a lot of overlaps. Again, I'm very glad to be here, and I look forward to hearing your excerpts.
Okay. Well, to be frank with you, you read part of one of the things that I'm going to read here, but that's okay. Repetition is not prohibited here. And what I've done, Mr. Ambassador, and to our audience here, I've broken our discussion today into three sections. As I think you've already heard, the first section will be defining a just war. The second section is going to be, is the West morally obliged to support Ukraine? And the third part of our discussion is going to be about what role should journalism play in a time of war. To begin and to give some context, here's a bit from my memoir. And again, you'll hear a little bit of repetition, perhaps not in this excerpt, but in future. The mountains of northern Nicaragua enjoy a mystique all their own. Nicaraguans refer to them not in the plural, the mountains, but in the singular, la montaña, or the mountain, as if the rugged backbone of the country were a single entity, one special realm apart from, but still within Nicaragua. Prior to the Sandinista takeover, La Montaña was a place where Somoza's hated National Guard conducted some of its most heartless repression against peasants who collaborated with or who were suspected of collaborating with the Sandinista guerrillas. It was a dark place of persecution, torture, and solitary death. Despite the hardship and danger, La Montaña occupies a special niche in Sandinista lore, the legendary tales of any guerrilla group being part of the heart and soul of that movement, and the reason why men and women risked torture and death for that movement. It was to La Montaña that the Sandinista Front sent its guerrillas for physical, psychological, and political training. It was in the merciless Montaña that the Sandinista cadres endured a sun that causes blisters on foreheads and noses, cold, damp nights that shake the body till dawn, hunger that disorients and actually hurts, solitude that makes men talk to themselves, and fear that steals their breath away. In La Montaña lurk typhoid, malaria, hepatitis, anthrax, and mountain leprosy, a parasite that embeds itself in human flesh and eats away at it in concentric circles, leaving pain and ugly scar tissue. The low-lying plains at the base of La Montaña is cattle country and home to nasty, inches-long pests, worms really, that Nicaraguans call torsalos. They normally thrive under the skin of free-ranging cows, but sometimes take up residence in humans. One of my colleagues had to have them removed by a physician who sliced open his skin to dig them out. I contracted a case of anthrax working in the same region. So I can imagine, Mr. Ambassador, that some of this brings back some memories about your time in Vietnam. From what I read and what I've heard from Vietnam vets is that the terrain in Vietnam was at least equally and perhaps more inhospitable than that of La Montaña, where I hung around in Nicaragua. So let's get right into the first question here. You state that Ukraine's war to defend itself against Russia, and by extension, the United States' effort to support Ukraine, are not morally ambiguous. You've already answered part of this question. Can you elaborate on that a bit further, please?
You bet, Bill. And just as you were reading that first part, I'm sure other people who served in Vietnam, we knew those little things that got into your skin as leeches, and they were there as well. Patrolling through mountains like your montaña is what we did. So we were again the 101st, where Captain Seitz and I were in the 101st, was to the west of a town called Way. And it was in the mountains, and it was exactly as you described. But that's not your question. Your question is on Ukraine. Yes. So Vladimir Putin has this, what I can only describe as an obsession with Ukraine that has led him to try to dominate it for a decade. Putin has been very clear about his attitude toward Ukraine. He's written it down in a long essay last summer. He's also put it in a speech just before he invaded Ukraine in February this year. He said that Ukraine's not really a country. He said that Ukraine is not sovereign. It only exists as part of Russia, and therefore he sees it as his mission as a great Russian leader to bring Ukraine, a sovereign country. Let's be clear, Ukraine has been an independent sovereign country for 30 years. It was dominated by Russians over centuries. There's no doubt about that. And Ukrainians know that all too well. The Russian czars, the Soviets, and now President Putin, they all want to have control over Ukraine. And the Ukrainians have maintained their nature, their people, their nation over the centuries, and they're very proud of their history, Bill. They're very proud that their history, contrary to what Mr. Putin says, Ukrainian history goes back farther than Russian history. So in the 9th and 10th and 11th centuries, the Christian Slavic civilization began in Kiev, in a civilization called, that we know now as Kievan Rus. And as an example of that civilization, in the center of today's Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, there is a beautiful cathedral, several beautiful cathedrals, many beautiful cathedrals in the capital of Kiev, but one is right smack downtown, and it's St. Sophia's Cathedral, and it was completed by the civilization that we now know as Kievan Rus in 1057. In 1057, this beautiful cathedral was completed. It took 20 years to build. In 1057, Bill, Moscow was a forest. Moscow didn't exist. It didn't show up in any document, any historical mention for another 100 years, another century before Moscow even is heard of, this little village on the river. And well before that, Kievan Rus in Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, was this civilization. So, and the Ukrainians are proud of that. They're proud of their history. They're proud of their culture. They're proud of their language. They're proud of their literature, their heroes. They've got their own heroes, very distinct from the Russians. And so when they finally got their independence, when the Soviet Union disappeared in 1991, and Ukraine voted to leave the Soviet Union, and they put it to a vote in every part of Ukraine, and every part of Ukraine voted to leave the Soviet Union as Ukraine, as an independent country, as a sovereign nation. And that was 30 years ago. And they're very proud to be free now of Russian domination, of Soviet domination, of Soviet empire domination. They're very proud to be, and they're fighting for it, because that's what Putin wants to take away. Putin wants to take away their independence, their sovereignty, their freedom. We say these words, and you make this point a couple of times, Bill, in your book, that some of these words, freedom, independence, democracy, we almost take them for granted, or we don't really know what we're saying when we use these as justifications for wars that we get involved in one way or the other. And you make this point very well. The Ukrainians know what freedom means. The Ukrainians know what independence means. The Ukrainians know what sovereignty means, what it means to be a sovereign nation. And they are willing to fight and sadly die to keep that. So this is why I say it's morally clear where the Russians are and where the Ukrainians are.
It's really surprising, and I think even the Russians will agree to this, that how ferociously the Ukrainians have defended their country, how hard they fought against the invasion. So thank you for that, Mr. Ambassador. Let's go on. Another question I have, and there's a little bit of background here, so it's a longish question. Is the conflict's image as a just war tarnished at all by some of the folks fighting in it? And I'm referring here to the Azov Battalion, the far-right militia based in the Donbass region that was created in May 2014 to resist Russian aggression in eastern Ukraine, and which actually figured prominently in the heroic resistance mounted over several weeks in the Mariupol steel plant. Some of the battalion's fighters have openly described themselves as neo-Nazis, and at least one of the group's logos bears an uncomfortable resemblance to the swastika. Russian President Putin has used the Azov Battalion's presence in the region to try to justify his invasion as a so-called denazification endeavor. From a distance, it seems like the sketchy ideological leanings of some Azov militia fighters got a bit of a pass by Western media, especially in the early weeks of the conflict. Critics say that this is because that kind of coverage wouldn't really fit the good versus evil narrative that has characterized a lot of Western media coverage. What do you make of this?
So the Azov Battalion, that as you just described, and you remind us that that battalion fought, and we have to say, heroically in Mariupol. Yeah. Defended that city, first of all, and then that steel plant long after they were surrounded, cut off from supplies, cut off from reinforcements, cut off from food, cut off from electricity, cut off from water. And in that steel plant, in the bowels, in the basements, in the caverns below that steel plant, were a lot of civilians as well. And so the Azov Battalion and others, there were Ukrainian Marines who were there as well. who were fighting the Russians who were trying to take over Mariupol. Now, we do have to put in context the Azov Battalion because no one denies that there were elements earlier on of far-right political leaning people in the Azov Battalion. They're probably, I talked to several of the leaders, some having been, talked to several of the leaders, and I know to whom they reported in, well, the time I was there, that is the Minister of Interior. And I had conversations with the Minister of Interior about this, about exactly, this is before the invasion, before the war started. And he knew the history. Ukrainians know the history. Ukrainians know that a small portion of the Azov Battalion are far right. Ukrainians know that there's a small portion of Ukrainian voters who vote for far right parties. I will point out, Bill, that proportion of Ukrainians who vote for far right political parties in elections is about 2%. It's about 2%. In other European nations that we know well, that percentage of voters that going for far right parties is much higher than 2 or 3%. I don't know what percent of far right voters in this country that might even be into the neo-Nazi category. All to say that there have been these allegations, and these battalions, these units made up of a wide range of Ukrainians, performed heroically. Last thing I will say about this is that, as you point out, the cynical use of this, again, small portion of the fighters by President Putin. And he says his whole justification for this unprovoked attack were Nazis in Kiev, and Ukraine has a Jewish president. So it's laughable. No one takes that seriously. This whole business about denazification, is a fantasy of President Putin. He had to find something to say to justify this invasion, to justify killing tens of thousands of Russian soldiers, not to mention tens of thousands of Ukrainian civilians and tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers. He needed some justification. He couldn't find it. There is no justification. So he comes up with these fantasies that he's going to denazify this country that's led by a Jewish president. So all to say that, yeah, there is that, and like any big diverse country, we all have our range.
Yeah, thank you for that, Ambassador. I take your point about the percentage of far right voters in any country. My older brother, who I think is watching at this time, Lou, has been in law enforcement all of his life. 17 years as a Pennsylvania state trooper. He's always been aware of how dangerous the far right can be, and he used to laugh at the notion that the left was going to try to take over the country, and he said that's not where the problem is. The problem is on the far right, and I'll bet you we've got a hell of a lot more than 2% of voters in this country who vote for far right candidates tomorrow or today. So your point is very well taken. I want to move to kind of the second section of our discussion, and whether the West is morally obliged to support Ukraine. And again, for some context, I'm going to read some of what you've already thankfully read for us. And I'm going to do so because it's tied into something that you haven't read thus far. So Let me find my bearings here. Yeah. Okay. Here we go. There were very few pitched battles between the two armed groups. Instead, the war played out in a series of ambushes or surprise attacks preceded by long stretches of slogging through tropical highlands, through ankle-deep mud, wearing the same wet, filthy, stinking clothes, and humping backpacks stuffed with everything I could carry inside plastic bags to protect my precious camera gear and film from the elements. I walked for days under a burning sun or a tropical downpour in the middle of the jungle, and in an instant, fights erupted and men began to bleed. Then I slogged again, sometimes documenting young Sandinista soldiers or Contras hauling their wounded and their dead. The Contra War resembled the Vietnam War more than it did the Sandinista-led revolution of 1979. And a couple pages later, I write, it was deep into the war, and I had established relationships with fighters on both sides of the conflict, Sandinista as well as Contra. During a conversation with one of the fighters, he told me about having dispatched prisoners captured during battle in the northern mountains. Open quote. They had faces like dogs, he said, close quote, as if that were true, as if that made it all okay. And I wondered, what was this young man like before the war? So I won't tell you which side of the conflict this young man fought on during the Contra War, because it doesn't matter. Because I believe young men on both sides of just about any conflict in any part of the world could have done the same. You and I, Ambassador Taylor, we know what can happen to men at war, because we've seen it. One of my colleagues who also covered the conflicts in Central America warned that he sees, open quote, a similarity between the Ukraine and El Salvador wars. In El Salvador, the US decided it needed to support the regime despite any outrage it committed, including raping, murdering US nuns, and assassinating the Archbishop. Likewise, we have let the Ukrainians know that we are on their side until victory, and nothing they do will change that. This gives license to the bloodiest human instincts, close quote. So my question is, until when is the West morally obliged to support Ukraine? How do we know when it disintegrates into something not so just, something else?
I'm glad you raised the point, Bill, about what young men can do in the war, in a war,
Yeah,
in any war, because we have seen and are now investigating and are horrified at the atrocities that the Russians have committed. Clear, there's no dispute. So the Russians to the north of Kyiv occupied small towns. We know the names of these towns. Bucha. Everybody who's read the paper over the past 2 months knows Bucha, knows Irpin. People who have visited Kyiv, heads of state, prime ministers, certainly the Ukrainian president has gone to Bucha. Their UN investigations, human rights investigations, war crimes investigations are going on in Bucha and Irpin and other cities. And they are horrified, exactly what you say, at the crimes, the atrocities, the war crimes. President Biden has called it genocide that they've found, that they've seen. And this might go back. I don't know what's in their heads, Bill. I don't know what's in their heads in this case. But what we know is President Putin, in that long, inaccurate, distorted historical statement about Ukraine, the history of Ukraine and Russia, Ukraine not being a country and not really being sovereign, really just being a part of Russia, that document was distributed to the Russian army, to the Russian soldiers. They were required to read this. So it's not just young men behaving badly because they're young men, and that's what some young men do. No, this was policy. This was policy coming down from the Kremlin, from President Putin himself. And so when these investigations of these atrocities, these war crimes take place, they're going to figure out who's responsible, who gave these orders, who allowed this to happen. We're talking about rapes. We're talking about rapes of children. We're talking about murders in the back of civilians' heads, shots. We're talking about hands tied behind their back and executed, left in the streets. This is horrible. This is war crimes. Now, your point is that our outrage, that our moral standards have to apply across the board. And that's certainly true. Certainly has to apply to the Ukrainians. And we have to apply whatever the process is, whether it's a judicial process in Ukraine, whether it's an international tribunal that goes into and examines the evidence for these atrocities and war crimes. Ukrainians have identified some Russian soldiers already and have put them on trial, and the Russian soldiers have confessed. So there has to be a process. We have to be even-handed. You're absolutely right. We can't just blame one side and not blame the other if there are violations of human rights, of the laws of war. No, we have to do this across the board. And the overwhelming evidence right now, this is not from the United States. This is not from Ukraine. This is from UN. This is from non-governmental organizations. This is from human rights organizations. They have found, in other words, neutral observers, they have found the atrocities attributable to the Russians. If there are Ukrainian violations, and I'm sure there will be, we should hold them to account. The Ukrainians have said themselves they will hold themselves to account. They will hold their own soldiers. The Ukrainian authorities have said they will hold their own soldiers to account for any of this kind of behavior. The Russians have not. Indeed, as I say, this might be Russian policy. So again, there's no moral equivalence here, in my view. There's no danger that we're going to give the Ukrainians a blank check to do any of this stuff. No, the Ukrainians have performed, as you have said earlier, heroically in defense of their country, defense of their land, defense of their homes, defense of their families. That's what they're defending. And they've done this heroically, and it's by, as far as we can tell, honorably. So we do have, I do think we have a moral obligation to support the Ukrainians. They are fighting our fight in some real sense. They are defending Europe from Russia. Russia, if it is able to take over Ukraine, it will then threaten NATO. It'll then threaten Eastern Europe. It'll threaten Poland. It'll threaten Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania. And those are NATO allies. They will threaten the Russians. If they are able to take Ukraine, they will threaten the United States. And so Ukraine is really fighting our fight. They are defending Europe. And we have an obligation, I think, both strategic obligation, as well as a moral obligation, to support them and support them as in their fight. At some point, they will be able to sit down and negotiate with the Russians. If they were to do that now, and they've said they're not ready to do it now, but if they were to do it now and agree to a ceasefire in place, that would be ceding a fifth of Ukrainian land to the Russians as a reward for invading, as a reward for the crime of aggression. And the Ukrainians are not willing to do that. And it's not just President Zelensky who's not willing to do that. It's the Ukrainian people who are not willing to give up Ukrainian land to an aggressor, to the Russians. You know, Bill, the Ukrainians, when I was there in 2006, 2009, so I was there twice. I was there in 2006, 2009, before the first invasion in 2014. And then I went back in 2019 as the acting ambassador, as a charge, and they were at war then. And this was two different Ukrainians. So in the first part, when I was there in 2006, 2009, there was a real debate. It's a real democracy. Let's be clear. It's a real democracy. It's changed. The president has gone from one side to the other, back and forth, different party, back and forth 6 times. So it's a real democracy. There's a real debate, real disagreements. When I was there in 2006, 2009, the real debate was whether the country should go more towards Russia or more towards Europe. And there were some legitimate political parties that were advocating to go towards Russia. And there were, in those political parties, there were people who had friends and colleagues and business partners, family in Russia. And there was, you know, good relations among even people in the other parts of Ukraine, in the western part of Ukraine, the northern part, that did not want to go toward Russia. They wanted to go toward Europe, adopt European standards, but it wasn't violent. So that was before the invasion. After the invasion in 2014, and now after this enormous invasion, Ukrainians hate the Russians. It's sad, but it is true. What Putin has done is created a hostile nation on his border, and it's going to be hostile for generations. He has destroyed any hope to live in peace, live in a friendly manner next to this nation. They hate him.
2 follow-up questions, Mr. Ambassador. One, so you're kind of convinced that there is a mechanism set up that will recognize when, I mean, believe me, everybody is who knows anything about this conflict understands that the Russian forces have been barbaric, and the Ukrainian forces, although we've seen a couple of things that don't look okay, their behavior has been 1,000 times better. But you're convinced there's a mechanism set up that will recognize when things are not being conducted in a just way, and that will somehow put the brakes on the Ukrainians. Is that fair to say?
It is fair to say. It is fair to say. The military, it's a new young military. That is, the leaders now, the general officers, are the ones that have come up through the last 8-9 years of war with the Russians. They've been fighting the Russians now since 2014. Yeah. And there's a new generation of leaders and soldiers who have been trained by Americans and other NATO allies. And there's an ethos, there's a discipline, there's an understanding of the laws of war. Of just war, Bill, exactly what we've been talking about. So that is unlike anything that's on the Russian side. The Russians that are still there, and yes, there is a justice system in Ukraine that will bring to justice violators
Okay.
of human rights. Absolutely.
Before we get into the next section, I want to ask one other question in this section, and they're probably the answer to this question I think it would be different depending on who responds to it. What we've promised the Ukrainians that we're going to be there until victory. We'll support them. What does victory look like?
It's a great question. It's a very good question, and President Biden knew that he had not, and his administration had not answered that question. And so about a month ago, he put in the New York Times an op-ed where he laid out the answer to your question. And what he said was that the US goal in Ukraine was for a democratic, independent, sovereign, prosperous Ukraine with the means to deter and defend itself against further aggression. So we are there, as you just said, and as President Biden has said, for as long as it takes. We don't know exactly how this is going to end. The Ukrainians are talking about, indeed, there's some indication that they've begun a counteroffensive to push the Russians back out. That's a major effort. The Ukrainians now have some of the weapons they need to do that. And as I say, the President Zelensky has indicated that if the Russians are back into the positions where they were on the 23rd of February, just before they invaded on the 24th of February, then he'll negotiate. And then there's a discussion about a ceasefire and about arrangements so that they can move on about their business. And getting to your question about what does victory look like, as President Biden said, a democratic, independent, sovereign, prosperous Ukraine is what the goal is. But they need to have the ability to defend themselves against further aggression, because if the Russians pull back, just like they have invaded and then stopped and then invaded again, they are likely to invade again. The Russians are likely to invade for the reasons that I said earlier about what Putin wants. Putin wants Ukraine, and he's not giving up. He's not giving up. So the Ukrainians need to have some way to seriously defend themselves, and so that's what victory looks like.
The Ukrainians are saying over and over again that they appreciate the support from the United States, but they're worried that it's coming too late. Some people, these are conspiracy theories. Some people think that the U.S. is delaying, for example, on the delivery of these HIMARS missile launchers, so that it would postpone for various reasons a Ukrainian victory over the invading forces. Why is it taking so long to get these missiles into Ukraine and functioning to push back? And according to the Ukrainian sources, I mean, that's critical right now, really critical.
It is critical. You're absolutely right. It is critical, and my view, it has taken too long. That we should have been providing the HIMARS that you mentioned, but other heavy weapons as well, much earlier. The HIMARS, that's interesting you mentioned that. We've probably all seen these articles over the past couple of days, really, that show what you were just saying, Bill, how effective they are in the hands of the Ukrainians. Yeah, and they're so accurate. These rocket launch are so, they can get within a meter. They can go within a meter, and so they don't have to be this bombardment, this area damage that the Russians are using, because the Russians don't have the precision. They just fire and they destroy cities, whole blocks, whole cities. So the Ukrainians are now able, and it should have been earlier. You're absolutely right. Should have been now are able to go after very precise military targets, ammunition depots, headquarters, concentrations of troops. The Ukrainians are very skilled now. One last point, Bill. I asked senior military in the Pentagon, I had a long meeting with very senior general, and asked him that question: how long? Why does it take us so long? And his answer was, not totally satisfying, but his answer was, we had to be sure that, first of all, the Ukrainians were trained on this system. It's a sophisticated system. You don't just send it out there and they jump on it. It turns out, of course, that all the instructions for how to use this are in English, and some of the Ukrainians speak English, but some don't. So there's some training that was necessary, he said. Fair point, fair point. And he said it took time to train the Ukrainians, and they would do them at a kind of platoon at a time. So they'd train one platoon and then send them back. And we said, well, why don't you train like 5 or 10 platoons at a time? And he said, well, it turns out that these are the best soldiers, the best artillerymen in the Ukrainian army, and to take them out of the fight for 3 weeks to train them. Actually, the Ukrainians said, well, we can do it in a week. And they could. They're very good at this stuff. But to take them out of the fight was a risk. This is all to say, again, I was not totally satisfied at the answer. And he would agree, and I would agree with you, that it should have been earlier. And had they had them earlier, they'd be doing better right now.
Yeah, especially because this conflict has seemingly, it's in like a duel of artillery and missiles, and these HIMARS have an extraordinary range, I believe, of almost 200 miles, and they're super accurate. So and anyway, I think we all get the point. They need these things. They feel they're not getting them soon enough. So let's move on to the third component of our discussion, and that is, what role should journalism play in time of war? And again, we're going to take a little trip back to my memoir here for a short read of a couple of paragraphs about my experience, covering these wars in Central America. Like many of the journalists working in Nicaragua at the time, I felt that our work was more a humanitarian mission than a job. We gave voice to the poor working class, the peasants, the laborers, whose voices would never be heard in their own country, and certainly not beyond the borders of their country, had it not been for us, the international media. With passion and empathy, we told their stories and revealed to the world their misery, in the hope that outside forces could help change their lives for the better. You will find journalists today who scoff at this notion that our craft is something more than a job. They will tell you that those who practice it with altruistic passion, even reverence, are soft-hearted idealists whose judgment may be skewed by emotion and therefore are not to be trusted. Don't believe them. Journalism is more than a craft. It's a calling. It's a manner in which one engages life. This is what I believe. This is what I practice. This is what I teach. So, Mr. Ambassador, let's look at some of the stories being told by journalists in Ukraine today. If in fact Ukraine's battle against Russia is a just war, as you define it, and I believe it, should Western media report on atrocities, and you kind of already answered this, should Western media report on atrocities committed by Ukrainian soldiers as well as Russian soldiers? The issue here, I think, is, would disclosures of Ukraine abuses not undermine Ukraine's chances for victory and what we believe is a just war?
I don't think so, Bill. I don't think so, for the reason that you and I hinted at before in the earlier part of this discussion. That is, if there are violations, if there are human rights violations, if there are atrocities committed, and if the Ukrainians do what I think they are ready to do and will do, if they identify them themselves, if their authorities, if their chain of command identifies it and brings those violators, Ukrainian soldiers, to justice, that will demonstrate to the world that this is a real democracy, that this is a democracy that values the rule of law, that this is a democracy that has a military that abides by the military ethos. So I think the answer to your first question is yes, of course, journalists should report on all of what they see, Journalists are there. I'm reminded, Bill, of the dedication. You've probably read this book too, but just for all the people watching, there's a great book written by a historian at Yale, Timothy Snyder, who wrote a lot of books about this, about East Europe and Ukraine. One of his great ones called Bloodlands, about that whole part of the world. But a more recent book, I'm going to get to the journalist point here, is The Road to Unfreedom is the title of it. And the dedication is, I think the words are, it's close to these words: for the journalists, the heroes of our time. And he says that because in his book, The Road to Unfreedom, he describes misinformation and disinformation and propaganda and lies that come from lots of places. He was focused on Russia. I would focus on Russia, but he makes the point that that the journalists are the ones to help identify the truth. And it's only by looking at the story, whatever the story is, from different angles and different reports, and different ways to justify it and rectify it and correct it and dig a little deeper into it. The journalists do that. So in his view, the journalists were the heroes of our time. They are going to save us from the lies that he thought was taking us, or could take us, to unfreedom, the road to unfreedom. So it's very inspiring.
Yeah, I got to tell you, I mean, it's like, you're preaching to the choir here. I can't tell you how many times that I tell my students, we, the journalists, we're part of the last line of defense of our democracy in this country. We're on the front lines of this whole battle for truth. Yeah. And, we've got politicians now who will get up in front of national television cameras, and they'll lie straight to the face of every American in the country. And
you can't let them get away with it. And journalists are there. No. Journalists are there. So, Bill, one other thing that I wanted to, on the part of the book that you read about journalism being a humanitarian mission, not a job. I thought that was a really important point. And again, some of the overlap between what you do and what I have done and what my friends and colleagues and Army buddies do as well is we are also on a mission, not a humanitarian mission, clearly, but we're on a mission, a national security mission. We believe that the work that being in the military, that defending the United States is a defense of the American people, and we're there at our government's direction, and we are there on a mission. And it's not a job. It's just exactly what you say. It is a mission. It's a national security mission that we're there. Now, that's not to say that that the U.S. government never makes mistakes. We know it makes mistakes. We know it makes mistakes. There's no doubt about that. But by and large, we try. When you go in the military, you swear to defend the Constitution,
right?
Enemies, foreign and domestic, and that if that Constitution holds and that constitutional order resides in the president and the Secretary of Defense and your chain of command, and they tell you this is your mission, then you do it. A great mentor of mine in a different context said, if your country asks you to do something, you do it. If you're going to be effective. And so it is a mission. It's not a job.
Let's get back to Ukraine here for a second. The New York Times published a story last week from the eastern city of Slavyansk. It addressed the effectiveness of Russian propaganda and the deep divisions in that part of the country. The campaign has been so effective that it's convinced some Ukrainians still in the city that the missiles that have landed in their city were actually fired by Ukrainian forces and not by Russian forces. The mayor of that city responded to the Russian propaganda by saying, quote, "Everyone sees what they want. They want to believe it," close quote. So how do those of us who believe in facts, in verifiable truths, in accountability, and in science push back against propaganda, unsubstantiated claims, and outright lies? How do we do that?
Facts. It has to be facts. It has to, and what are the facts? The facts are what the journalists dig up, find out, investigate, and they go to where they need to go to find out this. We can determine where missiles come from. You can do analysis of a crater, of a bomb crater, and you can tell in which direction the missile or the artillery round or the cruise missile, you can tell where it came from, just on that example. And that's why the mayor's exactly right. It's certainly possible, and we know who's firing at Sloviansk. It's the next city. It's in the next oblast after Luhansk. It's in Donetsk, and Donetsk is the next oblast that the Russians want. The Russians tried to get Kyiv. They tried to come down from the north and take over the capital of the country, Kyiv, and they were frustrated. They were defeated. They were pushed back into Russia. So they came around and they narrowed their aims. They didn't want to take the whole country again, they said. They may still want to do that. But they went all the way around, and they came in from the east, and they first took Luhansk, and now they're after Donetsk. And so we know the direction of the artillery. And if it turns out that the journalists look at that crater in Sloviansk and they say, "Oh no, it's actually coming from the west," we'll know it's fired by the Ukrainians. However, if it's coming from the east and the northeast, we know where it's coming from. So the mayor's right.
Yeah, the mayor may be right in this case, but I couldn't help, while I was reading this piece, I couldn't help thinking about some of the people in our country who watched, for example, what happened on January 6th and come away with a completely different version of what actually happened. I mean, okay, this is right in front of your eyes. You're seeing what actually happened. Don't you believe now? And they won't. So
some will, Bill. Some will.
I hope.
Some will. There's no doubt in my mind. There's no doubt in my mind that people will see and they'll believe their own eyes. They'll believe their own eyes.
There was another story in the New York Times. I'm a big fan of the New York Times, possibly because I know so many people who work in it, and they're really smart, good, hardworking people. And this story was about Western volunteers who have gone to Ukraine to fight alongside the Ukrainians, against the Russian invasion. And the last sentence of this piece, I'll read it to you. Quote, open quote, Matthew Robinson, a Briton who is a former US military contractor in Iraq, said he saw his service in Ukraine as a form of redemption for having profited from a war he now believes was unjust. And this just struck a chord with me. As I read the piece, I couldn't help but wonder whether the West's overwhelmingly enthusiastic support for Ukraine is rooted in part in a similar quest for redemption after having supported the very morally ambiguous war in Iraq. And as a follow-up, do you see any of this quest for redemption as part of your own response to having fought in the morally ambiguous war in Vietnam?
No. No, that's an easy answer. No, the war in Ukraine is peculiar, unique to Ukraine and Russia. For me, as we've talked about earlier, this unprovoked attack by the Russians on the Ukrainians, unjustified, couldn't find a justification, Putin couldn't, it's so clear what the moral justification is. And I've already talked about the strategic and the geostrategic and the importance of Ukraine winning in that regard. But the moral clarity, again, for me, is very clear. It has nothing to do with Vietnam. Doesn't, I served in Iraq, as you know. And I mentioned earlier, we make mistakes. The United States government makes mistakes. We make some mistakes, both in Vietnam and in Iraq. But for me, the support of Ukraine has nothing to do with that. Nothing to do with that.
Let me ask you, when did you decide that the effort in Vietnam was morally ambiguous? What was this during your work there, or was it afterwards?
Afterwards, it was very clear. It was very, very clear. So, and Bobby Seitz and I were just having this conversation today. We went there. We went to Vietnam as what? 22-year-olds, 23-year-olds. We were lieutenants. Later on, we were captains while we were there. We were there. I speak for myself, but I think others felt the same way. We were there not because we had thought through the moral implications or really even the strategic implications of the war in Vietnam. We were there out of a sense of duty. You mentioned that journalists like you, committed journalists, go toward the fight, go toward the violence. And my friends and Army buddies, we also went towards the fight. We marched, marched to the sound of the guns. That's where we went to Vietnam, not out of any great understanding of the strategic implications or the moral pluses and minuses. No, we went there, as I mentioned, because our government ordered us to. We did volunteer, but ordered us to do. And we felt an obligation, a loyalty to our men, was all men at the time, to our men, to the people in our platoon, in our company, to each other. That's what we were doing. Yes, it was a mission, a military mission. We did it to the best we could. And the answer to your question is, it was not until I got back from Vietnam. I was lucky to go to helicopter flight school when I got back. And I will tell you that helicopter flight school is not intellectually demanding. And I was able to do some reading that opened my eyes to how we got into Vietnam many years earlier. You will know it's David Halberstam's Best and the Brightest, talking about I think it's a New York Times reporter that you like so well. He wrote Best and Brightest, and that was an interesting story about how we got into it. By the way, I got a bone to pick with the New York Times. The editorial board about a month ago, I don't know, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, came out with what I thought was a morally questionable and strategically mistake, saying something that we talked about earlier, that, the Ukrainians are going to have to give up territory. They might, but that's not for the New York Times editorial board to say, or President Macron to say, who has said some very similar things. That's for the Ukrainian people, as evidenced by and as led by President Zelensky. That's their decision, not for the New York Times. New York Times also, by the way, just one last thing about the New York Times, they had a reporter in Russia in the 30s, and he went down into Ukraine, in the part of Russia, part of the Soviet Union. He was in Russia, he was in Moscow but it was during Soviet times, during the 30s. And he went down into the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic where there was a famine, where Joe Stalin had confiscated the food for Ukrainians and kept them from leaving. He engineered a famine that killed at least 4 million Ukrainians starved to death. That's a horrible death.
Wow.
And this New York Times reporter went down there, said, oh, nothing to see here. Nothing to see here. You know, the Soviets kind of walked him around, and he did, and he came back and reported on it. He won a Pulitzer Prize.
Yeah, I read about this guy a couple of months ago, probably.
Durante.
Yeah, but Mr. Ambassador, we're going to have to stop here, and because I'm being notified that we've got some people who want to ask some questions.
Right, good.
So Leslie's back, and she's going to take the reins of this. Thank you for a wonderful discussion. By the way.
Thank you, Bill. It was great.
Well, we have a bunch of great questions in the chat, so we'll see how many we can get through. But this first question is mostly directed towards Bill Gentile. Bill, how can journalists counter the propaganda within Russia itself, given the media climate there? How do you fight for truth on mute?
It's a hard question, and I think everybody's, trying to make their own way and figuring this stuff out. I guess it's an online battle that we have to struggle through. There's a piece in the Times about a group of journalists based in Kiev started they were fired. About 30 journalists were fired recently, and they decided to start their own English language paper. It's electronic. To counter the propaganda and the lies that were coming out of their former employer. We can build up blogs, we can become journalists, we can get our voices out there, we can organize, we can criticize news organizations, we can write to the editors and so forth. We can try to ask the people who finance those papers to not to finance them. Follow the money is one of the ways that we can really counteract the stuff that's going on. And I think we are at a critical stage of this conflict in the United States. This fight for freedom and for the truth. We're really on the edge of a major problem. So it's going to take all of us to get together and really stand up for what's right and what's truth. I hope that answers the question.
Ambassador Taylor, this one's geared for you. Even in a world where Ukraine is resoundingly victorious, is there anything that could or would cause Putin to stop pursuing full annexation of Ukraine, given his belief in the ideology of Alexander Dugin?
The short answer is no. Putin will never give up. Therefore, what we need to do, what Ukraine needs to do, and what the United States needs to do, what NATO needs to do, is to be sure that the Ukrainians can defend themselves. And this is what President Biden said in his op-ed piece. That is, he wants to see Ukraine with the means to deter and defend itself from further aggression. So we can't count on any peace treaty, can't count on any ceasefire, because exactly what the questioner asked, Leslie, is right. That is, Putin will never give up. He will never give up. So we have to be sure that the Ukrainians can defend themselves and deter another invasion. Now, another way to do that is to allow Ukraine to join NATO. They've applied to join NATO, and the Germans and the French are not wild about this. They've said no. But that would deter President Putin from another invasion, because he would then have to fight all of NATO if Ukraine were part of it. But one way or the other, we have to be sure that the Ukrainians have a guarantee that the Russians won't succeed in another invasion.
Let me pull up questions. Okay, this one's geared towards both of you. How do we Westerners help the Ukrainians win against Russia without this escalating to a nuclear war, as Putin has threatened on several occasions since his invasion?
I'll let you take that one, Mr. Ambassador.
Okay, Bill. Yeah, President Putin and his people have gone out of their way to remind the world that they're a nuclear power. This is just in case anybody's forgotten that the Russians have nuclear weapons. They remind us regularly. And NATO and the United States have taken that seriously. Of course, we have to take it seriously. This is a serious question about whether President Putin, who has done some outrageous things in terms of invading for the first time since World War II, that any nation has invaded their neighbor. So we have to take it seriously, this threat from the Russians, but we can't let it, and this gets to the question, it's a very good question, we can't let it deter us from doing what we have to do to defend ourselves and to protect ourselves by supporting the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians, as I talked with Bill about earlier, they're fighting our fight. They're defending Europe. They're defending NATO allies. They are defending us in some real sense. So we have to be sure that we continue to do that. And so far, we've been able to do that. I mean, the Russians have said, don't give them weapons or else we're going to use nuclear weapons. Well, they haven't used nuclear weapons. So we have to take it seriously. Last thing I'll say on this, and this is, again, it's a good question. The CIA, our CIA, has no more important function, mission, goal than to keep their eye on the Russian nuclear weapons. And the CIA's heard President Putin remind us that he's got nuclear weapons. And so they've been particularly interested, the CIA has been interested to see if there's any indication, which they could pick up, which they would pick up, any indication that they could see that the Russian nuclear weapons are being prepared for use. And so far, the answer is no. There's no indication that they are. We have to be prepared, we have to be careful, but we can't let it deter us.
Bill, did you have anything you wanted to add to that response?
I tell you, I found the Russian president's declaration, the use of this language about nuclear weapons, so offensive and so out of hand that I mean, who am I? I'm just a professor at American University, but I think that any leader in the world who uses that kind of language and those kinds of threats is not appropriate. It shouldn't be leading anybody. It's just humanity is just way beyond that. We're just beyond that.
Here's another one for both of you. How close are we to Ukraine becoming another forever war or quagmire like Vietnam and the various Middle Eastern conflicts?
Well, Bill, I'll be interested in your response to this. So just to be clear, there are no U.S. soldiers in Ukraine. There are no U.S. pilots flying over Ukraine. So we're not in a quagmire like we were in Vietnam, like we were in Afghanistan, like we still are in Iraq. We don't have soldiers there. That's a big difference. That's an important difference. What we are doing is we're supporting the Ukrainians in their attempt to maintain their freedom and their independence. And I will say that the Ukrainians want to end this war quickly. They don't want to keep this war going. It's destroying their nation. It's destroying their economy. It's destroying their people. It's killing their citizens. They don't want that to continue. So they have every motivation to stop this. And we have every motivation to help them stop this by providing them with the means of defense. And that said, the Ukrainians will not stop. The Ukrainians will not stop fighting for their freedom, for their communities, for their land, for their families. They will not stop. they will in the end be victorious.
I hope you're right, Mr. Ambassador. It seems though we're in this long protracted slugfest now, waiting for these new weapons to come in, and hopefully, I think the Ukrainians are planning an offensive in around August before it gets really cold. I mean, in the worst of cases, this thing will just drag on, and you know, there'll be an occupation of the country for what could be years. And there'll be a lot of guerrilla activity, like you know, happened in Iraq with IEDs and surprise attacks and so forth, and it can go on for a hell of a long time. Hopefully, you know, the aggressors here will decide that it's draining them too much, and they'll find some way to save face and get out of it.
Yep, exactly right.
Or maybe, you know, maybe Putin will be pushed out of office or something like that. I mean, that would be, in the best of cases, that would be, you know, it's going to have to take some movement inside the Kremlin to move.
Could happen.
What would you say to people who say the U.S. needs to prioritize its own domestic issues?
So I think the United States does need to put priority on its own domestic issues. I think the challenge, I think Bill's referred to this already, the challenge to our democracy is as dire as certainly in my lifetime. And so we've got a lot of work to do on our own democracy, on our own economy. We've got a lot of work to do. That said, we can do foreign affairs as well. We can do national security. We can defend ourselves abroad, which we are doing. We're defending ourselves abroad by supporting the Ukrainians. We can do both. And I think we have to do both.
I really think that this conflict is a domestic issue for us. You know, we're watching some of these democratically elected governments in Europe turning toward authoritarian regimes. And there's a lot of people in this country who want to go the same way. You know, if we've got to support the Ukraine, because if not, you know, it means that all of the institutions and all of the boundaries that resulted from World War II, everything's up in the air again. You know, this is about a change in the world order, and who decides. Not just who can get an abortion, not just who can get married to the person that they love, not just, you know, people who want to read certain books in school. Everything is on the line here. Everything is on the line. So it's all a domestic issue. We have to see it in that way.
I think we have time for one last question. Bill, people want to know what the rock and roll part of your book is referencing.
Well,
I do too.
You gotta read the book. I mean, you know, my life is I love music, and this happens to everybody. You know, music. I relate certain types of music and certain authors of music. I relate them to certain times in my life, and music. To me, has made wonderful contributions to my creative energies, to the friendships that I've made, to just, you know, going out and getting in what I call La Bestia, the beast that I used to drive around in Central America, and listening to music that made me happy, and it's just become it's part of my life. I send my wife crazy with these songs. You know, by Jackson Browne, which were popular 40 years ago. But, you know, that's the age where I lived some of the most endurable, long-lasting and fun experiences of my life. So, and I write about the rock and roll. It's all through the book. It's there, but you got to buy the book to figure that out.
The book. It's a great book. So Bill, Jackson Browne is going to be at Wolf Trap shortly.
Get out, really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that. Didn't know that.
Yeah, well, go see him.
You're going to go see him?
I should.
Maybe we'll go together. What do you think?
Doctor my eyes.
Running on empty. Okay.
Well, wonderful. Thank you both so much for your time this evening. I think we've all really appreciated the honest conversation that you two have had. The library will be posting this recording and making it available to folks. And don't forget, we're holding the raffle for 3 copies of Bill's books. So check your emails. You'll be able to see if you've won.
If I may add one additional comment here, Leslie, please.
Sure.
Ambassador Taylor, you've been wonderful, and we really appreciate your patience with us and your time you spent with us. I also want to thank University Library Librarian G. Davis. The library's head archivist and special collections and digital initiatives, Leslie Nellis, a special assistant to the University Librarian Claire Young, who really helped me out on this script, all up to the final moments before we went online here, and Michaela Bowen, the Administrative Operations Coordinator. You are a wonderful team. It's been a wonderful product, and I'm indebted to you. Thank you so much.
I am too. It's been a great time. Thanks for doing all this.
Take care, sir.
You too,
Good
Bill.
night, everybody.
Good night.